Welcome to another episode of the Islam Through the Ages podcast. I'm your host, Thaqib Musa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are really happy today to be joined remotely, unfortunately, because we are still in COVID situations, although it makes it much easier for us, by Dr. Fozia Bora. Dr. Fozia, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. Dr. Fozia is an associate professor at the University of Leeds. She completed undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at the University of Oxford, and she has a book titled Writing History in the Medieval Islamic World, The Value of Chronicles as Archives. She also contributes to various different websites and blogs, and she tweets avidly, I believe, at Fozia Bora, Fozia Bora. So our listeners can kind of continue the conversation afterwards. So Dr. Fozia, thank you very much for joining us. This is episode 1 of the Islam Through the Ages podcast.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
No, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you. So we're going to start the conversation around Islamic history. And I guess the first question as we set off is to define from the outset what we are going to be discussing. So what is Islamic history and what isn't Islamic history?
That's a very good place to begin. And I think that one of the things to really emphasize from the start is that we tend to hope and wish for an understanding of Islamic history, which gives us a straightforward timeline of what happened. And in practice, when you delve into the source material, when you look at the ways in which Islamic history has been recorded through time, which really is our means of access to it, it's not a straightforward story. It's not a straightforward history. It's an account of how history has been interpreted. So it's really a history of interpretation, which Muslims are very used to accessing their tradition through interpretation. That's the way in which the Quran has been understood. That's the way in which the Hadith and the legal schools have been developed. It's through interpretation. So historiography or history writing is in the same mold. It's basically a way in which the earliest sources have been preserved, read, transmitted, and reinterpreted for every new context and every new era. So really, what happened? There are some basics which aren't disputed, but for the rest of it, the detail, the nuance, the complexity, there are many readings. And that really is a source of great, an opportunity for deeper understanding and a source of great appreciation of our diversity as a Muslim community. So what it isn't is a straightforward narrative, a timeline, if you like, a chronology. And rather what it is a rich range of interpretations, stories, and an unfolding picture of both how the civilization of Islam grew from its early beginnings, developed over the course of time, unfolded differently in different spaces, with different kinds of agencies involved, different types of states were created or political entities were brought into being, and how these shape the lives of ordinary people. So it's an immensely varied story. So I hope we can touch on what that variety might look like through this episode.
So I think that's a very academic answer, and I kind of really enjoyed the fact that there's a lot of nuance inside of it. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of discussion around Islamic history and Arab history being sort of one and the same, and a lot of especially Western academia, when they talk about the rise of Islam, they often talk about it as the rise of the Arabs or the victories of the Arabs over Persians. And to what extent is that true? Where do we draw the line between Arab Islamic history and kind of just Islamic history, and the fact that Islamic history is wider?
I would say that the community of early Muslims may have seemed somewhat homogenous to our very much later eyes, but that community became multicultural very quickly, not simply because of the presence of non-Arabs in the in the Arabian Peninsula, but also because it's a history of conquest for the early period at least. So by 630, very few years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, you saw the conquest of Persia. And with the conquest of Persia came the incorporation into Islamic society of a huge bureaucracy and so on. So the history of Islamic society is characterized by multiculturalism, to use a very modern term. And so the idea that it's an Arab history would be incredibly misplaced. And I think that's probably understood, if not as widely as it should be. When you think about the kind of alignment between Arab history and Islamic history, it dissolves very quickly as soon as you get beyond the era that's called in the Sunni model the Rashidun era. So just a few decades after the passing of the Prophet. So yes, there is a conflation in kind of popular terms. I would say in the academic sphere, there has been a problem of framing the kind of, as you said, the Arab centrism, and also the Middle East centrism of that story has been very prevalent. But now it's more widely understood that we emphasize the Middle East, we emphasize the Arab world at the expense of other elements, of other ways in which we can appreciate how Islamic civilization grew and developed. So the spread of Islam to China, the spread of Islam to India, and then later on to Indonesia and to other parts of the world, to Africa and so on, those histories are now being excavated much more thoroughly. And the effect of that is that we have a much broader understanding that Islamic history should not be seen as from the Nile to the Oxus, as it traditionally has, but or even the River Nile to the River Oxus. In other words, a sort of central Islamic lands, but rather to look more broadly. Shahab Ahmad had a book, What is Islam?, in which he questioned that framing, but it's been questioned, I would say, in the academic world for some time now. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The Arab centrism of that story has been a problematic that we've dealt with, or we've been trying to deal with for a long time now.
Okay, that's very interesting. I like that definition of the two rivers, because the truth is Muslims crossed the River Nile very early on in Islamic history, and it was only a few decades that the River Oxus was crossed.
Right.
So I think coming on from that what question, we come to the why, which is, why does Islamic history matter, especially in our modern world?
I think that it matters for Muslims, and I'm going to answer the question in respect to Muslims, because obviously our audience for this podcast is primarily Muslims. Yeah. I would say that for Muslims, it's both a personal quest to understand the past of their religion, the birth of the religion, how it was kind of shaped by various influences over the centuries. So it's a personal quest to orientate yourself in relation to that past. It's also a communal question. It's a shared question. How do we see how the past has shaped our present, beliefs, our values, our norms, our cultural lives? And I think it's a burning question for a lot of people, and I get this question all the time when I'm in the Muslim community, that why don't we know as much as we should? And what can we do to avail ourselves of better information about Islamic history? And really, there's a huge interest in this topic. And the really lovely thing about this particular podcast is that it's there to answer that need, with a kind of a perspective which I hope takes us away from the dry academia a kind of angle that is already out there, but rather brings it down to earth in answering the questions of ordinary people. That what is my past as a Muslim? I may have a past as someone from Morocco or from India, but what is my past as a Muslim? What can I say about myself, or how can I think of myself as being a person in a very, very long line of people who share these beliefs, these practices, and so forth. So I think it's really a question which Muslims are understandably extremely concerned about, but haven't always had a very deep exposure to or means of engagement with. So it's both personal, as I said, and a shared issue for about identity and orientation.
Okay, what are some of the limitations and misconceptions that Muslims have around Islamic history in your experience?
So I mean, I feel slightly hesitant to speak about misconceptions when really the problem is that Muslim communities have not always had kind of powerful ways in which to access their history, the history of the religion, and the history of their particular communities within the broader framework of that religion. So, in a sense, I don't feel like sort of pointing the blame at them, which is what the word misconception may inadvertently do. But I would say that some of the problematic assumptions we have around Islamic history are that it's uncontested, or that the contestation of that history or the kind of disagreements about it are modern phenomena. But actually, the early history of Islamic society, the earliest Islamic societies based in Mecca and then Medina and then outwards, was always fairly contested. I mean, the biggest contest, if you like, or sources of disagreement began during the lifetime of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and soon afterwards, after his passing away, on the question of succession. So it's always been a history which is told in many different ways depending on who's telling it. And I think that really is comes to the heart of what any possible misconceptions in inverted commas might be. The idea that there's a narrative of history rather than a plurality of narratives of history. And I would say that in addition to that, one of the other problematics is that we tend to take a very broadly Sunni-centric approach in the sense that we project back onto the history of Islam ideas about the caliphate or about the kind of the growth of Islamic civilization, I would say in a way that doesn't take account of histories from below. In other words, it's a very elite history. And if we want to understand it properly, we need to get into the stories of those who haven't had a chance to tell stories from their perspectives. So I would say that one of the biggest misconceptions is that it's a straightforward story, not taking into account of the power dynamics that are involved in telling the story itself. So that's what I would emphasize is the kind of question of who records history, how are the stories told, and who benefits from those storytellings and who doesn't benefit from those particular storytellings. And I'm saying storytelling, in inverted commas, it's not fiction, but it's a factual history in inverted commas that can be told in many, many ways. So
And
that's a very long answer to what was a fairly straightforward question.
but I think it's kind of that point of history is always written by the victors, and so we need to, I guess, look at the subjectivities of the people telling us the story.
That's right. Yes, we do. We do. I mean, I would emphasize in this the really rich and interesting and important stories of those who have been left out of the narrative. I mentioned the Sunni centrism of our kind of understanding of history. That's fair enough, because that's how one orientates oneself in relation to a religious tradition. And if you're of a Sunni background, it's fair enough if you take a Sunni centric view. But we should bear in mind that there are non-Sunni centric views which are equally rooted in tradition, equally rooted in sources of a serious nature. But as well as that, alongside that, we should think more about things like what were the history of enslaved people on the very lowest rungs of society. How did they experience the political realities created by the caliphate system and everything that entailed, both politically but also in social terms, in cultural terms, and so on. What did life look like if you were an impoverished person, someone from a rural background, someone who, as I said, was enslaved, or if you were a woman, how did life look? So we have certain kinds of dominating narratives, and in this era, we're seeing more of a move towards trying to uncover the less told stories, the less understood aspects of Islamic history, and I think that's very, very welcome.
I think the question comes especially in modern times, because a lot of the ignorance that I think you mentioned as well, some people ask you questions about history and they feel like they're ignorant. Why are Muslims ignorant of parts of our history? And is this something that's new? Is this something related to kind of the past 200 years of colonization and kind of being uprooted? Is this to do with the slave trade? Or is it something that actually most modern communities are largely ignorant of their history?
It's a really good question. I think it's the overriding, kind of evidence we have is that history writing and historiography, and by historiography I'm using a technical term which means the recording of history in various forms. So the recording of history in various forms was not a straightforward matter, and we only get a written tradition of history writing or historiography something like 100 to 150 years after the passing away of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So that means that we had a period, an era of over a century in which everything we knew about early history was passed down through an oral tradition. Now, oral traditions can be extremely strong, powerful, and reliable. So I don't have any concerns about the fact that it was an oral tradition, but that makes it incredibly difficult to access eyewitness accounts except through this oral tradition. And because we now access it through a written tradition, or kind of written materials, largely written materials. I mean, there's also material culture, there's also buildings, archaeology, coins, etc., which can tell the story of early Islamic history. But primarily, we're looking at text. We're looking at the chronicles or the biographies written by historians who are usually scholars. So that material has been very much subjected to a kind of taking apart because of this kind of a gap between when things happened and when they were recorded in written form. So really, when we come to the question of ignorance around Muslim history, I think it's a problem that relates to the fact that we almost never had a very coherent and let's say gap-free way of telling the story. And secondly, I think a key part of kind of Islamic education over the centuries has really emphasized religious sciences at the expense of the context in which the religious sciences were developed. In other words, the historical context. And it's a curious thing because on the one hand, when we do look at the chronicles that we have, or the biographical dictionaries or the written materials which tell the story of early Islam, including the Sirah material and so on, they were often written by scholars who were scholars of religion. So they might have been specialists in hadith, they might have been specialists in the law, they might have been specialists in tafsir, and they write history, so to speak, on the side. But history was not an emphasized curriculum subject in the madrasa system, and it has not been emphasized enough in modern school systems, whether because of colonialism or other factors. I think one could have a debate about that, but it certainly lacked the presence and the centrality that you would expect. I mean, given how widely I'm asked about, quite fairly, rudimentary questions about Islamic history, and, questions about why don't we know it as well as we should. I ponder myself why it's so little emphasized when it's so key to everything else. The context is what really reveals to you so much about the texts. And we really need to have, more and better ways of accessing those narratives, but also the other forms of history telling that I mentioned, the material culture and so on. So it's kind of it's sad to see that we, are in this situation, but it's not unusual, I think, for communities for whom the past has been interrupted by colonialism, because that has had an effect on not just our education systems, but also on the resources that we have for telling our stories. For example, there was a book drain of manuscripts from the Middle East, which Ahmed al-Shamsi has written very cogently about recently in a new book. And that really is kind of exemplifies the fact that we have lost a lot of resources for telling history. And also that our schools' agenda, the curricula, have been shaped in societies that are post-colonial, getting over the effects of colonialism. So all of that is a kind of a long-winded way of saying that we have been, we've had, poor resourcing of history and historiography in some key ways, both through history in the past, but also in the present day. So here we are right now, and I think it's really an important time for us to think about how we can work against that erasure and work against that lack of emphasis, and really bring it back into the mainstream. And that's certainly something I try to do in my teaching and my research, is to sort of talk about why this matters for all of us, whether whether Muslim background or not. This is really important to emphasize and to grapple with, because it really explains everything else.
And I think the way I've always kind of, and again, this is maybe one of those misconceptions, is that there were a few key moments. So, for example, the loss of Baghdad when the Mongols came, and kind of there's this dramatic visual imagery of the rivers turning black with all the ink that was lost, and that's kind of thought of as this is when everything happened. And then when the British marched into Cairo and then later into Jerusalem, etc., that's where we lost all this. But what I'm kind of getting from you is that it wasn't those dramatic moments necessarily that it happened in. It was actually kind of a gradual erasure.
I think that you can always find turning points, important kind of pivotal moments when it seems that everything changes. But there are so many of those. And I would say that when we look now at the kind of earliest accounts we have of Islamic history, so someone like Tabari, for example, Tabari was a tafsir scholar who wrote an immensely valuable book of history in many volumes called Ta'rikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, a history of dynasties and kings, sorry, prophets and kings. And his book is one of the most comprehensive early accounts. Again, we're talking, sort of 3 centuries or so after the passing of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But nevertheless, that's one of the accounts which collects earlier reports. So reports which go back supposedly to the time of the Prophet and so on. When he writes history, he's trying to make sense, amongst other things, of the early civil wars in Islam, the Rashidun Caliphate, but also the fact that the Alid communities were denied an opportunity to express their political and religious agency and so on. He talks very openly about all of that. But he's also grappling with the Abbasid revolution of 750 CE, which, for him was a massive turning point. So really, the turning points are many. And it's good that we tell the story through some of those, because they were indeed, a change of regime is important. At the same time, it's a very elite way of telling history. A dynastic change is, of course, it's monumental, but it's also something which may not affect every individual overnight. It doesn't change lives overnight. And again, it's the top-down model of history writing and history reading that I've talked about before. It only gets you so far. So yes, the fall of Baghdad was, of course, a highly significant moment. The Mongols came to play a massively important role in reshaping Islamic societies. But at the same time, it's one of many turning points. And I think to get behind the turning points, I think it's good to look at history through the lens of ordinary experience where that's possible. Of course, the problem then arises, what are the resources that we have? What sources can we draw on to tell the stories of people who are not elite? And that's where we're seeing new approaches come into play, mostly in academia, but hopefully that will trickle down or trickle on and translate into more popularly accessible works. I mean, one thing I can mention here is the popularity of the TV show Ertugrul. And Ertugrul, even though it's fiction, because the history it's based on is just a sliver of information in much later Ottoman Turkish historiography, the fact that it's so popular across the Islamic world shows what a thirst there is for history, and we don't have, currently have very good means to engage with it on a popular level. So we're in an interesting moment where there's a revival of interest, and we need to match that with a revival of good resourcing of engagement.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there's a lot of kind of spin-offs of the same producers creating more. So there's definitely the kind of rising market of that. But then when it gets fictionalized, sometimes how many people are getting the true image versus, as you said, who's actually writing it and who's producing the show and what are their agendas.
Absolutely, particularly because we can't separate it from the kind of political ideological project of the countries in which these dramas are produced. There are very few opportunities for producers to be free of those agenda, I feel. So yes, we might think, well, creative products answer popular needs, but they also answer the needs of governments and modern day elites. So it's a real problematic for us. At the same time, I'm pleased to see the burgeoning of interest, the kind of the flourishing of interest in history. I think that's fantastic, and I think it's for us to then step up to the challenge of producing, better resources. I mean, you mentioned truth. There isn't, as you know, I'm sure, a truth or a truthful version of history, but we can certainly talk about, the accuracy of some of the depictions you see in Ertugrul, even though we wouldn't expect a popular TV show to be slavishly faithful to kind of historical kind of realities. At the same time, the liberties that are taken in shows like that, I think, is quite troubling. I think it can lead you well up the wrong path in understanding how these societies worked. Having said that, I'm all in favor of a good show with a historical theme if it brightens your Sunday evening. So I don't want to knock the genre. I just think it should be done with more attention paid to what the actual historical sources tell us about the past. Even if not from that era, you can draw on other historical sources to try and see what might have been the flavor of life in those times. So yeah, it's a complicated question. How do we sort of find the right resources? How do we get closer to truth in inverted commas? But certainly there's much better scope to do that now than there ever has been before, because there's more interest, I would say, on the part of both governments and people to access Islamic history in ways I certainly haven't seen in the last sort of 15-20 years, and that's very positive.
No, definitely. And I think so, kind of coming back to that ignorance point, so there's interest, which kind of the hope is that the ignorance will start to reduce, but at the same time right now there is a lot of ignorance of Islamic history within Muslims. And what effect does that kind of manifest itself in the modern day on Muslims today?
I think it's quite disorienting to not know the Islamic past very well. I should preface that by saying that we do have certain resources and books and books in particular, which have told key aspects of the story of Islam very effectively, in ways which suit the devotional needs of Muslim communities. So, for example, the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, whether it's through Martin Lings's very famous biography, which in itself draws on Ibn Ishaq and earlier models, or if you have, or you could talk about Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, who died in 1999, and his Qisas al-Anbiya, stories of the prophets, and stories of the Sahaba, and so forth. So there are resources that we have had at our disposal. And bearing in mind these books have been translated into many languages, but they, I would say, give us a devotional understanding. So as Muslims wanting to understand our past, the early story of the birth of Islam in religious terms. So what does it mean, in terms of your, for your belief, for your practice, for your faith, for your identity as someone who for whom their Muslim identity is important. But if you want to look at that same history in terms of how good is the evidence, what has been the interpretation of that evidence, how are these stories contested, who are the people who would tell that story differently, and why would they tell it differently? I think that's been less available to us, and I think that the need for a coherent narrative of the past is very human. I don't think the layperson, the average person, wants to be reading five or six books per topic. They don't have time for that. They don't have headspace for that. At the same time, to tell the story of Islamic history in terms of complexity and richness and diversity, I think is really empowering. It's not something to be concerned about, and it certainly isn't something that should dent faith or cast doubt on the integrity of the past. Rather, it should show us that just as we live in a very complex world in which we keep multiple frames of reference in mind all the time, so did Muslims of the past do that. They might have lived under a khilafah whose outlook they didn't share, just as we might live under governments whose outlooks we don't share. At the same time, you have a set of values, kind of which bind us together, and bearing in mind that some of those values were not simply Muslim values, but were shared across religious differences, religious communities. So if you look at, for example, Cairo in the, sort of 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, we have the evidence from the Cairo Geniza, which is a treasure trove of documents and papers from and leaves of books from the Jewish community preserved in a synagogue, which miraculously survived to the present day and is being examined by scholars. That shows a picture of Muslims, Jews, Christians, Coptic Christians and others, living lives with many parallels. So, that story of diversity, difference, and yet coexistence. I mean, I'm not saying it was always peaceful coexistence, but certainly coexistence, I think is an immensely important story for us to understand today. And that diversity and difference and living with difference is something that's there from the very beginning of Islam. And I think we should pay more attention to that in the present day. It will really help us to understand our present predicaments better. It will help us to frame our past better in ways that helps us in the present. And I think it's a way to, I would say, counter the frustrations you get with political processes which don't answer our needs. I don't just mean Muslims in this context, I mean Muslims as well, but there are many people who are marginalized and who don't have political agency or even cultural and other kinds of agency in the modern world. And I think it's important to frame that in the context that Muslims have been ingenious and have been resourceful in preserving their traditions in spite of various pressures of that kind. I mean, the ulama classes were often in the pockets of those in power, but there were also so many countless ulama who refused to bow to pressure from people in power and paid the price for that. And I think, those kinds of stories are also empowering for us in the modern day. So yeah, the effects of not knowing the history has been, I would say, quite profound. On the other hand, we have ways to empower ourselves to gain succor and strength from narratives of Islamic history.
I think that's really kind of it's really well explained, and kind of that the effect it has is so kind of multifaceted and seeps into so many different areas.
Right. Yeah.
I guess the question from a Muslim perspective is, and this is kind of on Muslim exceptionalism, so is the history of Muslim civilizations markedly different from the history of other civilizations, or are we kind of just another civilization alongside the Romans and the Greeks and all these different ones that came?
Right. So I would say that on the one hand, we're very lucky because Islam being a later religion than, say, Judaism, Christianity, to take the two other major Middle Eastern origin religions, it's said that Islam was born in the full light of history. And what's meant by that is that we can have access to resources which tell us a clearer story about, life of the Prophet, or the ways in which early Islamic society was a continuation of, or a radical departure from what came before. That story is now being told not simply through chronicles and books, but also through inscriptions being found on rocks in the desert and so on. And the fact that we have those kinds of resources which are still being uncovered right now, you have dozens of scholars who are looking at resources which have never been examined before. So in that sense, it's extremely well resourced and rich. So when we say it's born in the full light of history, we're talking about Islam having more for us to go on than, for example, the histories of Judaism and Christianity. Having said that, if you look at other civilizations, the Chinese, to take one example, they also, like the Muslim Khilafah, developed a very powerful bureaucracy. And the importance of bureaucracy is that not only does it order society and make it functional in financial and other ways and political ways, it's also a way in which the self-representation can become very, very strong and powerful, because bureaucrats and governments and administrations often want their history to be preserved, whether that's through monuments, so buildings, or I mean statues are not really a feature of Islamic society for obvious reasons, because it's not an iconographic tradition. But however, sultans or emirs or caliphs would often endow large buildings. That's to leave their mark. In the same way, the writing of history was often, as you said, the writing of the history of victors. So there's a strong interest in leaving a mark. And you see that also in other civilizations. I mean, the Chinese also had strong bureaucracies, and that meant they also had bodies of scholars and bodies of administrators who were highly literate. And it was the same in Islamic society. The bureaucracy was manned by people, usually men, who were literate, often in multiple languages. So that meant that the written record was in good hands. So the history of Muslim civilization is different from that of other Middle Eastern religions, the two major Middle Eastern religions, Judaism and Christianity, but it's similar in terms of its resourcing to what you see for civilizations that were in their heyday at a similar time. So the Chinese, for example. In terms of the civilization, I mean, the word civilization, I have a slight problem with it because it's incredibly abstract and broad, and it covers a multitude of different sort of cultural factors. And I would say that one of the problems we have had in decades of let's say, internal Muslim kind of narrativization of the Islamic past is that we use this term civilization and everything that entails. It's a very odd framing to me. It's extremely broad. It's elitist, rather, if we talk about Muslim communities and their cultural norms and their kind of lived realities, you get a much more differentiated picture, which I think speaks better to what we need from history than the idea of civilization. Civilization to me is a kind of reinforcement of the top-down view of history. That's my perspective on it. So I would say that while we are better resourced than historians who are looking at other types of, other eras or other, civilizations, as you said, nevertheless, I think it's good for us to get away from that framing itself.
I think that's really that's a really flipping the question a little bit and the thinking. And I think that can be a whole other episode that we talk to you about on how do we even approach Islamic history, and how do we maybe get away from that civilizational approach or the dynastic approach, and actually what resources can we get at to interact with how people were actually living their lives. And I think that's a very kind of interesting topic. I'm conscious of the time, and I think unfortunately we do need to kind of close off. So I have kind of a closing or wrap-up question for you, which is, what lessons as Muslims should we and ought we to derive from our history?
So I would say that it's tempting to want to look to the past and say, well, what can I learn personally, and what are the analogs that I can bring into my life? What analogies can I draw? And I think on the one hand, if you're looking at it, from a Muslim religious perspective, you can look at the stories of the story of the life of the Prophet or the people around him, the companions, and particularly, I mean, I should emphasize that, there were many very, very important and powerful women around the Prophet. Can we use those to find inspiration and a guide to how we should behave? That's all perfectly great and wonderful. I think we can certainly do that, and we can look on the past for sort of spiritual nourishment. That's a completely valid and legitimate use of that of those narratives. At the same time, I think that we also need to be aware that that's one way of approaching the past, and I think that if we want to be, I think my personal view is that all human beings are intellectuals in their own right. They have intellectual questions. The Quran says that we were made to reflect. and we have deeper questions. So on the one hand, inspiration is great, and we can draw lessons from that history. At the same time, I think we also have a desire and a need to look a bit deeper. Who are these people? Why do we not know more about the muhaddithat, the women who perform the crucial task of transmitting and preserving the hadith corpus, and the canon itself? Why do we have particular emphases? We know in the Sunni model that we have 4 caliphs who came after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who were called rightly guided. Does that mean that everybody who came afterwards was unguided, was not righteous? Have we done enough to examine those stories and those questions? So I think that we can certainly look to the resources we already have and take comfort from them, and learn some lessons from them, particularly when it comes to right behavior, being people of good values who try to help others and so on. I'm speaking in very general terms because the Quran speaks in those general terms, as do the Hadith, and as do the moral exemplars which are spoken about in the tradition, whether in the Hadith or whether in historiography. I think though we have to be very careful not to make that the sum and the limit of our understanding of history or our interest in history. I think it's important that we also look to historiography and to the other means of narrating history as a way to understand the richness and the range of experience that comes together to form the Muslim past. And that, I think, helps us in another way, not simply to be good Muslims who, kind of try to do the right thing and try to, prepare for the akhirah in an appropriate way, but also I think it helps us to be good people in the world today, good citizens, good people who can look to the past and see that plurality is the norm in Muslim societies, and therefore that should help us to feel better able to integrate in whatever situation we find ourselves in. I'm not saying Muslims are not keen to integrate, rather often because of racism and because of all sorts of issues, Islamophobia, often Muslims who want to integrate are prevented from doing so. So I'm not in any way saying that Muslims don't want to integrate. In fact, Muslims have shown themselves, like many migrant communities, have shown themselves to be incredibly adaptable. But at the same time, I think understanding that complexity, the diversity, the kind of the contested nature of some of those narratives, I think is very helpful to us in all sorts of ways, to feel like there are things that just don't change, and that's okay. There's always going to be a competition about which stories get told, and that has always been the case, and it's nothing to be afraid of or worried about. It's basically that's the story of human survival, and we can, I think, draw strength from that as well as from the stories of the prophets and the companions and so on.
I think that's been really enlightening, and I really like that kind of approach of we're not just looking at history to get the lessons, we're also trying to kind of derive strength from it and all of that. And I really look forward to having you on again for a future episode, for further conversations, perhaps on some of the tangents that were raised today, or on new topics. So we really appreciate your time, and I'm sure that our listeners will really benefit from this, and perhaps they can engage with you further by following you on Twitter and some of the other blogs that you write on. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Thaqib. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you very much. And we will be back with another episode of Islam Through the Ages podcast, and see all of the listeners then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.